Yabucoa, Puerto Rico, September 2017.
Hurricane Maria would be the second of two monster hurricanes that would impact the Caribbean during the 2017 hurricane season. It would start as a weak tropical wave out in the main development region on September 12th, would remain fairly organized up to the Lesser Antilles, and would be designated a hurricane on the 17th despite its center being exposed. However, during this time, Maria started to get a lot more better organized and would explosively intensify from an 85 mile an hour hurricane at Category 1 to 175 miles an hour Category 5 monster at its peak. It would go on to devastate the nations of Dominica and the island Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, where Puerto Rico had been impacted by Irma 2 weeks prior. Most of the infrastructure still hadn't recovered before Maria made landfall there. Maria would end up causing extremely catastrophic damage to the tune of almost 3,000 people being killed in Puerto Rico when it made its landfall, and would eventually end up going through Puerto Rico out into the Sargasso Sea area, right along the Turks and Caicos, the Bahamas, would impact Bermuda just slightly, go up through North Carolina, bringing some storm surge warnings and rip currents there, and would then harmlessly go out into the northwestern part of the Atlantic Ocean. Logistically, Maria was a disaster for Dominica and Puerto Rico, costing almost $91 billion, the third costliest hurricane in the Atlantic Basin, and the most dangerous and costliest for Puerto Rico and Dominica, respectively. Dominica, the last time it had been hit by a storm of this magnitude that would eventually be retired, was Tropical Storm Erica a few years prior. So Maria being one of the two dangerous monster storms of the 2017 hurricane season.
Puerto Rico was set back a long way in the wake of Maria, and its legacy will be long felt in that island. Of course, it caused a massive emigration wave, and of course some parts of the island didn't have power restored or even water restored for quite a long time, and some places only getting power, I believe it was over a year after the storm actually occurred. Certainly a extremely devastating storm, as we can see on these images. Hurricane Maria, number 20 on my top 100. Brigantine, New Jersey, October 2012. A tropical system first developed in the Caribbean Sea out of pretty much nothing really, and became Tropical Storm Sandy, stalling for a while and then accelerating northwards, passing by Jamaica as a Category 1 hurricane and strengthening further to its Cuba landfall at peak as a Category 3. It then continued through the Bahamas and then swept up the US eastern seaboard and then curved round in this very menacing approach towards the coast of New Jersey, turning post-tropical by the time it made landfall. Well, it's all quite simple when you look at all of the icons on the map there, but in reality, Sandy was an enormous storm. When we take a look at some of the satellite imagery, you can see its influence extending out hundreds of miles, one of the biggest Atlantic storms recorded. And of course, it was already, for a good while, transitioning slowly but surely into an extratropical cyclone, even when it was reaching its second peak as a Category 2, when it was just about to round that bend towards the coast of the northeast. The storm made landfall just north of Atlantic City in that aforementioned town Brigantine, and then continued inland, moving northwestwards and dumping a lot of rainfall over some parts of the US. Of course, it came with strong winds and a terrifying storm surge with its enormous size, very widespread strong winds, and flooding was a major issue from Sandy as well. The highest rainfall amounts were around 12 inches in Maryland, in terms of the United States rainfall totals, that is, and the storm also caused snowfall further north as well, being a late season tropical cyclone with a very extensive exterior. I guess that was pretty much to be expected. Sandy was a magnificent storm to look at in just how odd it was. And of course, people may remember back at the time, the National Hurricane Center was sort of constrained by their own protocols, where they didn't issue any tropical related warnings further north than the coast of North Carolina, because they thought it would be turning post-tropical. I think it stayed tropical longer than they thought it would, before finally becoming extratropical just about an hour or two before making its landfall in New Jersey with Category 1 force winds. Sandy caused serious damages in Jamaica and in Cuba, and it also killed 54 in Haiti, but most of the fatalities came from the United States, where the storm made landfall in the end, with the final total across the whole path at 233. Damages, though, in real terms, or in terms of monetary damages, 75 billion now the quoted figure, with 183,000 buildings damaged and 15,000 destroyed. Sandy was an incredible storm for reasons that are quite unique in terms of its track, its size, and the area that it affected, and it's certainly one that will be well remembered due to the unusual aspects of how the storm came to be and where it ended up. Hurricane Sandy, number 19 on my top 100. Bathurst Bay, Australia. March 1899.
Cyclone Mahina moved off the Solomon Islands and then made a beeline basically towards Queensland in a very similar track to how Yasi tracked in 2011. And Mahina's impacts were probably exacerbated by another tropical disturbance named Nachon behind the storm that tracked over the Northern Territory into the Gulf of Carpentaria and then across Queensland as well, just days after Mahina. But of course, the main feature being Mahina. Mahina was the most damaging cyclone in Australian history. It was also the deadliest cyclone in Australian history, claiming over 300 lives. And it occurred at the height of the pearling industry as well, and in the height of the pearling season in March. So any ship basically within a 100 nautical mile radius of Mahina's centre was toppled like you couldn't imagine. The damage that Mahina brought ashore as well was unparalleled in any metric. Houses, well-built houses made of limestone or bricks, were completely toppled. The storm basically wiped Bathurst Bay and Cooktown off the map as it made landfall, and those were thriving settlements as well at the time, and it took years and years to rebuild those settlements. And again, this is at the height of a booming pearling industry, similar to what the gold rush was for Australia. So Mahina's impacts were not just felt in that area, but felt across the entire Australian economy. So if you're talking on a proportionate scale, Mahina could have been the most costly cyclone to make landfall on Australia if monetary values were adjusted for inflation.
With 407 killed on top of its 43-foot storm surge, Cyclone Mahina is number 18 in my top 100. Charleston, South Carolina. September 1989.
Hurricane Hugo was a classic Cape Verde hurricane that occurred during the 1989 hurricane season. It started out as a general thunderstorm cluster on September 10th, right on the peak of the hurricane season, and would move across the main development region, becoming a hurricane by September 13th. It would then become a Category 5 2 to 3 days east of the Lesser Antilles and would maintain Category 4 status all the way through the Antilles and into the northeastern part of Puerto Rico. It was during this time when it was maintaining its Category 4 status that the reconnaissance aircraft hurricane hunters would go through the storm a total of 76 times. One notable mission had the well-known meteorologist Dr. Jeff Masters on board for NOAA 2, call sign Kermit. One particular pass, Dr. Jeff Masters decided to have the plane come in at right around 1,500 feet, which normally is the 925 millibar level of a tropical storm in terms of the atmosphere. 925 is usually where you see most planes come in when they're thinking it's a tropical depression. However, Hugo would catch this mission by surprise, having mesovortexes in its eye wall. This caused NOAA 2 to go from about 1,500 feet, causing one of their engines to overheat and barely survive at an altitude of 800 feet, they would actually have to penetrate the eye wall and then slowly orbit through the eye in order to get back up to a safe flight level, which is right around 7,000 feet before they would successfully get out of the influence of Hugo. Hugo then would go on through, causing devastating damage in the Antilles and Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico not receiving impacts of a hurricane of this magnitude since Hurricane Betsy of 1956. So Hugo being a very classic hurricane for the 1989 hurricane season. It would then go on through the Bahamas and would strike Sullivan Island in South Carolina during the overnight hours as a Category 4 storm, bringing devastating damage and causing a lot of deaths. A total of about 68 deaths would occur within Hugo and would be the deadliest storm to hit the U.S. since Hurricane Frederick of 1979. So Hugo, definitely one of those classic storms that many people remember.
Hugo made landfall in the United States with winds of 140 miles per hour sustained. Its total damages amounted to $10 billion, with 83,000 buildings damaged, 15,000 destroyed. It also caused 450 millimeters of rainfall along its route, peaking with winds of 160 miles per hour to the east of the Lesser Antilles and a minimum pressure estimate of 918 millibars. Hugo, an impeccable storm, number 17 on my top 100. Tokyo, Japan. September 1958.
With the news of the day camera as Typhoon Ida takes a savage thrust at Japan.
This memorable storm in Japanese history began near Guam, moving over there as a newly formed tropical storm, and then rapidly intensified on 2 ramps upwards there, the second one taking it to Category 5 status, an extremely powerful storm as it continued northwards. Actually a fairly short-lived storm, Ida made landfall there on September 26 as a weakening typhoon, but was still packing a very strong storm surge and had a fair amount of size with it as well. Well, Ida was an extremely powerful typhoon at its peak, with estimated wind speeds of 205 miles per hour and recon suggesting a pressure of 873 millibars, which would make it very nearly the most intense storm ever recorded. That was based on inference from an 877 millibar reading in the eye wall. It wasn't actually in the eye itself. Nonetheless, when Ida made landfall in Japan, it was one of only a few typhoons to be given a historic Japanese name known as the Kanagawa Typhoon, and it became certainly a very well-known one. Making landfall as a Category 3 with 120 mile per hour winds, it killed over 1,200 people and caused at least $50 million in damages, although the actual total is unknown. Damages amounted to 18,000 buildings damaged and 2,000 destroyed. It also was a significant rainmaker with 419 millimeters of rain. Also worth noting that the surface temperature in the eye was suggested to be around 33 degrees Celsius, which is very nearly the record high. What really made Ida extremely deadly was the landslides that occurred across Japan, which caused massive problems along the obviously the rugged terrain in that area and contributed to most of those fatalities. Heavy rainfall in short bursts can increase the amount of runoff and certainly take people by surprise with massive torrents of water that flow down these hillsides. Typhoon Ida, an extremely dangerous storm it was, and a historic one from that historic year in the Western Pacific, number 16 in my top 100. Guam, November 1962. A tropical depression formed over Micronesia and quickly intensified extremely fast to become a Category 5 super typhoon. Before we'd even known what the name was, pretty much. It was named Karen, and it went on to strike Guam near its peak intensity and continued into the Philippine Sea, where it then started to weaken. One of those November powerhouses that really ramped up very quickly in the low latitudes and managed to hold on a little bit longer as it continued to the upper latitudes and died off as it reached around 34 degrees north. It then sped off towards the east, towards the international dateline. Well, Karen's effects are well publicised in Guam. It was an extremely devastating storm, making landfall with winds of probably 175 miles per hour. Certainly that's what the wind gusts were estimating at landfall as well. Karen was an extremely incisive storm in Guam, a very destructive and powerful landfalling event, and rumoured to be the worst in Guam's history, certainly the worst in modern history. It's been said that 95% of all buildings were completely erased off the map in Guam, and the rest of the buildings that stayed standing were significantly damaged. It was an enormous storm that caused really huge impacts across the whole island of Guam. Not so much for the neighbouring islands, although they still felt it too. Lots of people had to relocate. Thousands were evacuated to other US territories out in the Pacific, places such as Wake Island and off to Hawaii and even California. 37 were unlucky enough to have been killed by the storm, which caused at least $250 million in damages. 3,000 buildings damaged, 5,000 destroyed. That's what we know of at least. And this was a really incredible storm impact. Imagine if the island had been much larger with a larger population, the storm's impacts would have been even worse. Karen peaked probably with winds of 185 miles per hour, even though there's no images of the storm at peak, of course satellites being in their infancy at the time, and an estimated central pressure of 894 millibars. A very powerful late season typhoon that certainly won't be forgotten in that US territory. That's number 15 in my top 100. Trujillo, Honduras, October 1998.
Hurricane Mitch was the 13th named storm and last major hurricane of the 1998 Atlantic hurricane season. Mitch originated from a tropical wave that left Africa. Now, that tropical wave will later move into the Caribbean Sea and became a tropical depression just north of Colombia. The first model predictions and the first forecast shows that Mitch could move towards the Gulf of Mexico or maybe make a landfall in the Yucatan Peninsula. Now, due to the good conditions present in the Caribbean Sea, Mitch intensified into a Category 1 hurricane and started a deepening process, will intensify into a Category 3 and then into a Category 5. Mitch peaked with one of the lowest pressures ever recorded in the Atlantic. Mitch will later take an unexpected turn to the Gulf of Honduras and later towards the south, threatening said country. Mitch later became a stationary system north of Honduras, dropping insane amounts of rains, causing hurricane and tropical storm force winds for several continuous days and nights. After that, he weakened into a Category 1 and made landfall in Honduras. Some days after crossing the Central American and Mexican region, it regenerated into a tropical storm in the Bay of Campeche and made landfall in Yucatan and then made a third landfall over Florida, causing several tornadoes. Mitch will later become an intertropical system. It crossed the Northern Atlantic and then it dissipated north of the British Islands. A large part of the survivors, mostly those from Honduras, reported that the hurricane took them by surprise, mostly because the hurricane effects firstly arrived at night. In Nicaragua, the northern region, which is a region composed by the province of Chinandega, Jinotega, Madrid, Nueva Segovia, Matagalpa, and other regions, was particularly affected due to its landslide-prone geography. Almost all the country saw how rivers left their flows in violent ways, dragging everything in their paths, including the most resistant structure. In Esteli, the local rivers simply disappeared due to all the mud that the landslide brought to its flow. The river also destroyed the main town bridge, leaving the city incommunicated. However, Chinandega was the most affected province. The rain saturated the land so much that on October 28, 1998, a large part of the Casita volcano became a deadly mudslide that buried 3 towns. The most populated town was Pozoltega. It is considered as one of the worst disasters and most deadly disasters in the Nicaraguan history, with more than 2,000 deaths. Also, because most of the economy in the country and in Honduras at the time was agricultural based, the two nations saw how Mitch also caused them economical issues, leaving many families homeless or without food. Several other problems, such as sanitary problems, appeared in the country. In Honduras, most of the cities were affected, most especially Tegucigalpa, which is the capital city, and the country development was simply destroyed.
After stalling along the coast for a few days, Hurricane Mitch finally limped ashore Honduras, making landfall on October 29th. Before it reached land, it struck the particularly Guanaja Island severely, with massive storm surges reaching 2 meters and winds of over 120 miles per hour sustained for 2 days. The storm caused serious problems to the Bay Islands before it moved ashore and caused substantial losses of water and power. By the 30th, Mitch was unleashing itself across the entirety of Honduras and Nicaragua and other neighboring countries, causing massive erosion along rivers, landslides, mudslides, and substantial flooding issues. And as a result of this, a lot of people at this point were being lost. October 31st, with the rainfall from Mitch only just beginning to relent, there still was plenty of time for the landslides to really make their mark, as seen here with a massive slide occurring down into the river below. In some areas, particularly in the capital, Tegucigalpa, water levels reached around 33 feet above their banks, causing serious issues in the city. The center of town was substantially impacted and seriously hit by the floodwaters. It's also believed that around 1,000 people in the capital were killed by Hurricane Mitch. November the 1st, we get our first aerial views of the damage inflicted by Hurricane Mitch in some of the country's major rivers in Honduras. The whole country has been affected in some way by this storm, and aid workers are starting to arrive in the area, particularly teams dispatched from Mexico and Cuba. The infrastructure of the country was severely impacted, particularly transportation, where it was estimated up to 80% of the transportation network was destroyed, including most bridges. This caused serious monetary damages and power outages as well, causing massive areas of the country to go without power for quite some time. November 2nd. After all of the flooding and the rush of water, it starts to become a little bit less quickly flowing as the water starts to flow out, but some areas of course have been severely flooded and a lot of stagnant water remains. A week since Mitch first started impacting Central America, aid is still trickling in, but slowly. Of course, with the transport network severely impacted, many areas are still struggling to get anything. And as you can see here on these images, some of the larger rivers were still flowing quite substantially, quite dangerously, and potentially taking away some more buildings and infrastructure there. As you can see, more slabs of road falling away to the elements. November 5th. At last, some fair weather in the country. Some places potentially reached up to 1900 millimeters of rainfall in the mountains, and that water is still only fading away slowly. Of course, that may uncover some nasty secrets underneath. Aid continues to pour in, mainly via helicopter, as you can see on these images here. Authorities announced that 8,000 are unaccounted for. November 6th. It's estimated that around 70% of crops are destroyed.
Hurricane Mitch damaged so many roads and bridges in Honduras that trucks are finding it hard to get through to many areas. Helicopters are proving to be invaluable.
November 7th. Some places can now clean up, whilst others remain inundated with high waters. The impact of the storm renders around 3 million homeless, and at least 1 million were still refuging in shelters at this point. Additionally, some places were harder to reach than others, and food supplies and any other essentials were not being fully distributed. Couldn't be helped, of course, with the impact that the storm caused in some of these areas, and in some other locations the damages were starting to be counted. November 8th. Several thousand are dead and 12,000 are injured nationwide in Honduras.
Red Cross experts from Mexico are helping their Honduran counterparts search for bodies in this river which runs through the capital Tegucigalpa. Thousands of evacuees made homeless by Hurricane Mitch are now living in squalor on the banks.
It's easy to forget what the ground still looks like after the fact, after the storm has moved on, but the impacts continue to linger and affect millions of lives. In some places things were getting worse, a refugee crisis and now a rise in diseases caused by unsanitary conditions in the aftermath of the storm, as well as hunger in some areas, particularly rurally, which was extremely devastated by the storm as it moved through. Let's not forget it was not only Honduras that suffered from this storm, although it suffered the most. Places like Nicaragua, El Salvador, and into Guatemala were also severely impacted in some areas. Hurricane Mitch will certainly be a memorable storm for these areas, and we hope that we've done justice to the actual full story of what happened after the storm struck. Number 14 in my top 100. Barbuda, September 2017.
Hurricane Irma was one of, if not the most violent storms of the 2017 worldwide cyclone season, and served as one of the strongest storms ever recorded in the Atlantic Basin. Irma was the first Category 5 hurricane on record to strike the Leeward Islands, and is considered to be one of the most powerful hurricanes ever recorded in the open Atlantic region. It is also considered the third strongest Atlantic hurricane at landfall, just behind the 1935 Labor Day hurricane and Hurricane Dorian. The ninth named storm of the 2017 hurricane season, Irma caused widespread devastation throughout most of the Atlantic Ocean, including in the Caribbean and Florida. Irma was the most intense hurricane to strike the continental United States since Hurricane Katrina of 2005, and became the first major hurricane to make landfall in Florida since Hurricane Wilma of the same year, and the first Category 4 hurricane to strike the state since Charley of 2004. Irma began as a tropical wave near Cape Verde on August 30th and intensified to a major hurricane on August 31st. The storm's intensity often fluctuated between a Category 3 and a Category 2 in the early time of September, and intensified to a Category 5 on September 4th, becoming one of the strongest storms ever recorded in the Atlantic Basin. Early on September 6th, Irma peaked with 1 minute sustained winds of 180 miles an hour and a pressure of 914 millibars. Irma became the second most strongest tropical cyclone worldwide in 2017 in terms of barometric pressure, and the strongest worldwide cyclone recorded that year in terms of wind speed. The storm weakened to a Category 4 on approach to Cuba, then weakened to a Category 2 as it was in Cuba, and then proceeded to strike Florida as a Category 4. The storm continued to move up the western Florida coast and made landfall in the panhandle of Florida before stalling in Georgia and eventually dissipating. However, Irma will not be forgotten in the minds of many in the Atlantic Ocean and throughout the world, as it served as one of the strongest storms ever recorded in the Atlantic Basin and will be remembered for decades to come. Irma definitely was, I think, one of the first storms I tracked, and it was a very bad storm. There's very few storms that people realize are going to be a very damaging storm, but when Irma formed, we knew it was going to be one of the just a storm to remember, and certainly it lived up to that task. But I don't think Irma will be ever forgotten, at least in the next 50 to 100 years. It was the capstone to a historic 2017 hurricane season, and it'll be remembered for as long as I live. So it's a bad system and definitely deserves to be on the top half of this list.
Arguably the biggest moment during Irma's life was its intensification pattern. As mentioned, it stayed fairly stagnant for a few days between Category 2 and 3, but it was on the 5th of September, the morning of, where it intensified quite rapidly from Category 4 up to a Category 5, from 140 miles per hour I think it was, to a satellite appearance supported maybe 150, 155, but recon flew in and went and found 175 mile per hour winds in this storm. Nonetheless, on the visible imagery, it looked really phenomenal on some of these images, particularly as we look back at it here. I think this will be ingrained into our minds for quite some time with the storm, particularly with the angle of the satellite, where you can really see everything going on, and the shadow slowly encasing the eye in the later part of September the 5th. On the 6th, Irma made a Category 5 landfall on Barbuda, decimating the island in the early hours, and with a landfall intensity of 916 millibars, the strongest storm to make landfall on the Lesser Antilles, breaking the old record of 918 millibars set in Guadeloupe way back in 1825. It then struck the rest of the Leeward Islands, delivering particularly harsh blows to St. Martin and the US and British Virgin Islands, passing through both of those areas still as a Category 5. Continuing just north of Puerto Rico, getting away with it marginally, although it was to be visited by much worse later in the year. It then continued on towards the Bahamas, still a Category 5 when it was passing closest to the Turks and Caicos Islands, and then re-attaining Category 5 as it made landfall on the eastern coast of Cuba. After traversing through Cuba, it then of course made itself felt in Florida, affecting the Florida Keys, Key West as a Category 4, and then eventually making landfall slightly weaker as it moved in, making landfall near Marco Island, and then proceeding up the west coast of Florida, still as a hurricane for another 12 hours or so before it continued to decay. Irma was initially rated at 185 miles per hour, but was slightly downgraded in post-season analysis. 180 is now the actual number, with an estimated central pressure of 914. It caused approximately $60 billion in damages, damaged 224,000 buildings, destroyed 22,000, and caused one of the largest evacuations in history, particularly in Florida and Cuba. 7 million were displaced. Hurricane Irma, a legendary storm from September 2017, appears as number 13 in my top 100. Galveston, Texas. September 1900. A tropical storm developed in the open Atlantic in the last days of August and slowly started moving west-northwestwards towards the Lesser Antilles, passing through the Leeward Islands in late August in the last 2 days into the Caribbean Sea, and then reaching the coast of Hispaniola, moving over the island and then onto Cuba, where it got a little bit stronger. Continuing through this area, the storm then moved further towards the northwest, affecting southern Florida with tropical storm force winds, and then rapid intensification ensued over the Gulf of Mexico, reaching Category 4 status, and then striking the coast of Texas near Galveston and moving inland towards the north and then northeastwards. The remnants of Galveston hurricane actually strengthened quite a bit in those higher latitudes over the United States and into Canada, and reached hurricane status equivalent once again before speeding off out over the open waters of the Atlantic, the North Atlantic by that point. Well, as we know, in Galveston itself, this storm was absolutely monumental. It caused a cataclysmic flooding and surge event, and many buildings were blown down from wind as well. The Galveston hurricane made around 10,000 people homeless out of a population of, I think, 35,000 in Galveston at the time. And just after the storm impacted, approximately over half to 60% of the entire city was underwater. Scores of buildings were destroyed, over 3,600, and no doubt many more would have been damaged along the coastal areas. People had gone missing at one or two various points indeed, when at the height of the storm the whole island may have been underwater, given that the storm surge was probably around 12 feet, and the highest point on Galveston Island I don't believe is around that high or somewhere close to that marker. Loads of scatterings of driftwood and debris all across the coastal shores, and unfortunately dead bodies intermingled with all of that made the operation of not rescue but recovery quite difficult. Of course, on land it was difficult enough to clear all of the wreckage, which took some time as well. Galveston was dealt a huge economic blow by this storm's impact as well, as you would expect, and it's believed that no less than 12,000 may have been killed by this storm. However, it wasn't just in Galveston that serious impacts occurred. It did occur further along the storm's track when it turned extratropical in the northern United States and into Canada particularly. Off the east coast of Atlantic Canada, actually, quite a few fatalities occurred from shipwrecks there, from people who, I suppose, weren't expecting a storm to emerge off from the landmass. And so around 230 were killed in Canadian waters, and that's actually one of the deadliest storms in Canadian history, as well as one of the deadliest storms in United States history. Earlier in its life, impacts were relatively minor in Florida and across the Caribbean islands, although they were dealt with serious, severe thunderstorms and strong winds, of course. But the Galveston hurricane will be remembered for the longest time for its impacts in what was a thriving coastal city, and it took many years for Galveston to recover, although they did build up their flood defences after it. Another hurricane that arrived 15 years later would prove to have been not quite as bad, even though it was a similar intensity, and so maybe there was a silver lining that came out of this enormous catastrophe. The Galveston hurricane, not very many videos of course back in 1900, but there are some, and quite a few images as well of the buildings that were blown down. A lot of them of course weren't as well constructed as you would get today, of course, and so that also added to the issues. That's the Galveston hurricane, number 12 in my top 100, and a very deadly Atlantic storm. Bola, East Pakistan, November 1970.
Let's set the scene. In 1960, two storms struck the then country of East Pakistan and killed upwards of 20,000 people, which led to a lot of criticism directed at the central government establishment. In response to this, the central government asked the assistance of the American government in mitigating disaster and depression. The then director of the newly formed National Hurricane Center, Gordon Dunn, would carry out a detailed assessment and submit his report to the East Pakistan government way back in 1961. Unfortunately, it wasn't acted upon at the time. Fast forward to the first week of November in 1970, when in Tropical Storm Nora forms and dissipates in the Gulf of Thailand in the Western Pacific. Why is this significant? That is because what would follow was that its remnants would contribute to the formation of the Bola cyclone, which would become one of the worst storms to ever form in world history. Swept past the area of East Pakistan and killed upwards of 300,000 to 500,000 people. It's considered one of the deadliest storms ever recorded. I believe there were reports of at least one place seeing nearly half of its numbers being killed off in terms of population. The far-reaching consequences of the storm were immense. It had multiple consequences, and many far-reaching areas where issues were found. For instance, the storm outright became the catalyst for a civil war in the region, and also caused a wider war between the regional powers of the area. So that also goes down in history as one of the worst storms and one of the only times a natural disaster triggered a war. Then, in another case, the United Nations triggered a resolution in 1971 in response to the Bangladesh storm, which led to the formation of the World Meteorological Organization panel on tropical cyclones that we all know today and designate storms. So, in terms of significances, it was very far-reaching.
More pictures from the ravaged areas of East Pakistan. Pictures which bring home to us all the extent of this overwhelming tragedy.
The helicopter pilots witnessed the pitiful sight of whole villages turning out to signal their desperate need for help. Disease was as much a threat as starvation. Pakistan Army doctors began inoculating as many people as possible against cholera. With watercourses polluted by the decaying carcasses of men and animals, risks of a cholera epidemic were considerable.
Many of the images and videos available of the storm are actually too graphic to show. Lots of videos and photos showing masses of dead bodies along the coastlines. However, we're still able to show you a lot of the aftermath of the storm, where people were desperate for assistance and aid, which was difficult to get through at times. In the beginning, there were no helicopters from East Bangladesh that were available for aid work, and foreign helicopters were actually sent in. This storm was an absolute disaster, as we know. The eastern side and southern side of the island of Bola was the worst affected, certainly in terms of death toll. On the east coast, some areas had up to 50% mortality rates. It's estimated that up to 500,000 were killed by this storm, with at least $86 million in damages. At least 10,000 buildings were damaged and 176,000 destroyed by this storm. Peaking as a Category 4 with winds of 130 miles per hour, that's our estimate peak. Well, there's a little bit of wriggle room around that estimate. It probably weakened a little bit before making landfall, but it was clearly the surge that caused the major issues and the strong winds, of course, at the storm's landfall. An extremely delicate location in terms of sensitivity to storm impacts, and of course, as we heard from Soham, it caused political ramifications as well. That's the Bola cyclone, number 11 in my top 100.